This presentation will teach you what to expect in a technical interview at Microsoft, and will help you to be successful during your interviews with any company. Our agenda for this training is as follows. We'll start by talking about what Microsoft is looking for when interviewing candidates. This information will be applicable to many other companies as well. Then we'll talk about the format of the interviews, namely, how do 30 to 60-minute interviews progress from start to finish? Then we'll talk about questions that you shouldn't expect, and those questions you should expect. We'll cover some common mistakes you can avoid, and we'll finish by going over some general tips for success. So what are we looking for when interviewing candidates? There are 5 main things that we look for. First, we look for raw talent and for confidence in yourself. What's the person's current skill level? What training has helped them get there? And based on that, how great do we think they can become? We know that candidates come to us from all different backgrounds and kinds of training. So we also look for your ability to learn during the interview. Chances are you'll see something during the interview that you've never seen before. We want to know how quickly can you figure out a solution to a problem that you haven't confronted before. We look for creativity and passion. We're solving some of the world's hardest problems, and we need people who not only have the analytical skills to solve those problems, but also the creativity to solve them in ways that we haven't thought of before. We want you to explain to us not only what the solution is, but also how you got it. And we want you to show us you can work effectively in a team. There are also a few things that we're not looking for. We aren't looking for you to always get the right answer. In fact, our interviewers will typically give you harder and harder questions until there's one that you don't know the answer to, because they want to see how you deal with problems that you haven't thought about before. And they aren't looking for generalities. Get to the facts, use data, and use your analysis. Every interview will feel a little bit different, but the typical interview format is as follows. It starts with a warm-up, where you and the interviewer introduce yourselves. They'll talk about what they do at the company, and they'll try to put you at ease. Next, they'll ask you about what you want to do. Why do you want to be a software developer? Why do you want to be a marketer? Next, they'll talk to you about your past experience. Hopefully you've written a good resume, so they'll have lots of information already in front of them. Then they'll get into technical questions. They may be coding questions, or problem solving, or testing, or things in general. Finally, they'll wrap things up by seeing if you have any questions for them about Microsoft or the team. Back in the 1990s, Microsoft as well as other software companies used to ask brain teaser questions such as, how do you move Mount Fuji? There are whole websites and books dedicated to it, but we don't ask those questions anymore. Nowadays, we don't really care about that, and neither do most other companies. Questions like that have limited use because there are plenty of ways to practice them in advance, and there's only one right answer. So what are the questions like today? Now we ask questions that are open-ended and may have multiple answers. They aren't normally trick questions, but they may be puzzles or other logic tests. Our interviewers will try to ask you questions that you haven't answered before, not to try to trip you up, but to see how you deal with problems that you haven't confronted before. They may ask you about things that you are working on or have worked on, so be ready to explain any projects. And they want to see that you can combine your skills in new ways and in new problem areas. There might also be coding questions. If you're applying for a software job at Microsoft, you have to be able to code, even if you want to be a program manager. They'll typically ask you a question involving algorithms, and you'll solve it using the whiteboard or some paper. You almost never will be typing into Visual Studio or something else. They want to see that you can completely code from memory. The language that you use isn't important, but you have to be able to code well in at least one language. And finally, when solving the problem, the soundness of your logic is more important than the correctness of your language syntax. So take the time to make sure your logic is sound. We ask coding questions first because we need you to demonstrate that you can code. Second, so we can see how you interact with other people, in this case, your interviewer. And third, so we can make sure that you double check your work. We may also ask you non-coding questions. If they give you general problem-solving questions, pause, think about them, and ask your interviewer clarifying questions. If they ask you biographical questions, be ready to talk about the projects you've completed, what those challenges were, and what you learned from them. There are some key mistakes you should avoid. Make sure your resume is up to date, make sure you're familiar with the job you're applying for, and think about the different product groups we have at Microsoft, which technologies we work with, and be ready to talk to your interviewer about it. You can find more information on these by visiting microsoft.com/university. Here are a few more mistakes to avoid. Make sure you take the time to think through the problem before answering it. Ask clarifying questions to help you understand what the interviewer is looking for. Give specific answers to their questions. And when they ask open-ended questions, keep providing answers to them. Sometimes what they want for you to do is to provide as many good, reasonable solutions as possible. So don't get caught in the trap of saying just one of the many answers that you found. Talk about them one by one. If you get coding questions, talk aloud about the solutions that you're coming up with. Describe your logic and your thought process, and verify that your solution actually works. Go back and test it before saying you're done. Some general tips for success. Know your strengths and weaknesses. Focus on what is most important when answering the question, and be concise in your answers. Make sure you know your stuff. And finally, if you aren't selected one year, reapply the next. Plenty of candidates go through Microsoft interviews a couple times before getting the job. We always encourage you to reapply and try again. You can find more tips on how to succeed in a technical interview, as well as other information about applying for a job at Microsoft by visiting microsoft.com/university.